Hi, I'm the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Gaver, Presbyterian minister of 3 congregations in Eastern Ontario. And right now we're doing a study on why so many denominations. So it's a quick overview of church history. And so we cover 2,000 years of history in a very short time. You know, we're not going in depth. And but it's a good introduction if you've ever wondered, why do we have so many denominations? Why are Christians always splitting off from each other or disagreeing with each other? What's going on? This is the chance to find out some of those answers. So I hope you can join us. And right now I'm going to turn it over to the PowerPoint presentation. So just a moment. So we're going to start with prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for bringing us together to learn more about the work you do on earth and your church, your body on earth, and what makes us tick and what causes problems. And we just ask you to be with us and to guide us so that we hear what we're supposed to hear and learn what you want us to learn. Guide us so that everything we say, do, and think even is pleasing and acceptable to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So last week, we covered, this is sort of the outline of what we're going to be doing. And last week we covered from Jesus to Constantine. Today we're going to be focusing from Constantine through to the Middle Ages. So some of the highlights that we did last week. Jesus had a very simple message. Love one another as I have loved you. He repeated it over and over again. And that's a pretty good indication that there were disputes going on among his disciples, that there were fights and cliques and whatever, even while he was alive. When we read the rest of the New Testament, we find those fights within the early church boiling over. We find Peter's involved with them and Paul, and they're trying to hold the group together. There's divisions, but there's, after all the arguments that are coming along and all the fighting that is happening, there are 2 main issues that seem to be dividing the church. One is the question of who Jesus was. Remember, for us, we're working on basically the answer that we've been handed down for 600 years. Jesus is the Son of God. But for those first 300 years of church history, Jesus is the Son of God, or Jesus is God made flesh, or Jesus is a prophet filled with God's Spirit, or Jesus is a human being, Jesus is a prophet, Jesus is half and half. So all those, that was being worked out. And so you had all sorts of different answers emerging. And they shaped the second issue, which is, what is the relationship between the church and Judaism? Jesus was a Jew. He lived as a Jew. He died as a Jew. The first Christians were Jews. Christianity began as a sect within Judaism. So if you were converting, if you were a Jesus follower, you were converting to Judaism. But as more and more non-Jews converted to becoming Jesus followers, they wanted to follow Jesus. They didn't want all the 613 commandments. They didn't want to keep kosher. They didn't want to be circumcised. And so you had this dispute going on. Which laws do we have to obey? Which laws don't we have to obey? And it really wraps up in, who do you say Jesus is? If he's a human being, we have to keep the laws that God gave to Moses. If Jesus is more than human, then do we really need to keep the Mosaic law? So that's sort of what's going on. And sorry, I'm going to. So that's what we covered last week. This week, we're looking at Constantine. He was the first emperor who converted to Christianity. So he's the first Christian emperor. He's in about 300 AD. And there were good things he did, and there were bad things that came out of his conversion experience. So one of the questions, what do you think some of the good things are? Well, he called together I'm going to tell you the answer. He called together the bishops from all over the Roman Empire. So I don't have a map this time because that was last week's session, but the Roman Empire spread from England, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, North Africa, Algeria, and all those countries, Morocco, etc., Egypt, Israel, what's now Turkey, Greece, the Balkans, and up to Italy again. So there were bishops from all these areas, and Constantine called them together to Nicaea and said, okay, there's lots that's going on in Christianity, and I want very simple, like one-page summary. This is what Christians believe. So the bishops came from all over, and they discussed and they resolved some of those differences. What comes out of that is the Nicene Creed. And we still use that Nicene Creed in many of the churches. It's the core set of beliefs. This is what's really important about Christianity. The other thing they did was they decided which books made it into the New Testament and which books couldn't, were rejected from being in the New Testament. So that's some of the good stuff that comes. We found out who we are, what it means to be Christian, and what is our grounding texts. And so that's really good. On the bad side, the church had power. They'd aligned themselves with the emperor. And once they decided this is what Christians believe, then anyone who didn't believe that was labeled a heretic. And then they were persecuted. So instead of Romans persecuting Christians, now it's Christians persecuting Christians. So that's pretty bad. Church has power, and that's always dangerous. And we're going to see that play out over and over again. Mass conversions for the wrong reasons. Maybe not so much at the time of Constantine, though I'm sure it happened, but certainly after Constantine. So let's say you're a Roman centurion, Roman government official, and you know that the emperor is Christian, and you want a position, you want to fill that job vacancy in the government office, you want to get close to the emperor, promotion. What are you going to put on your resume? He's a Christian. I'm going to put I'm a Christian, and he's going to favor me over those non-Christians over there, so I get the job. So you start getting some of this, people that are becoming Christian because it's the political thing to do, not because they believe in Jesus or follow Jesus. And that's some of the bad thing that happens. And in fact, some historians think this is when the church starts to go wrong. Now, last week we watched this video that's available on YouTube. It's a great video. It moves very fast. It's covering 2,000 years in 10 minutes. But you can pick up from about 4 minutes, 10 seconds, which is around Constantine, up to 621. And that's the period we're going to look at today. So there's the link, and you can copy it down or just Google and find the church history in 10 minutes and watch it. And when you're ready, come back and we'll continue. Here's a picture from the video. Of course, this isn't a real map of the Roman Empire, but because Germany and Denmark were never part of the empire, nor was Russia. But the Roman Empire, this gives you a sense of how big that Roman Empire was. And remember, yes, they had Roman roads, and yes, you had sea routes, but it still takes a long time, or took a long time, to get from Constantinople to England, for example. And so you start to see the empire split. Constantine was emperor, and he established his capital here in Constantinople, which is Constantine. And eventually, the empire actually splits physically so that you have an emperor in the west and an emperor in the east. This empire tends to speak Greek and is based in Constantinople. The Bishop of Constantinople is quite important. This Western Empire basically speaks Latin. Their capital is Rome, and the Bishop of Rome is El Papa, the Pope, and he becomes really important. At this time, the empire split, but it was still just one church. But you can see that the church is moving in different directions. Greek, Latin, different dates for Christmas, different dates for Easter. Okay, they're beginning to drift apart. The first split, and it's not so much of a split as much as one group just left, and those were the Nestorians. They did not accept the Nicene Creed, the definition of Jesus. They are Christian, but they do things differently. And they're still around. Not too many, but they're still around. There's some in Iran and some of those countries, because they basically went outside of the Roman Empire into Asia. Now, the Roman Empire eventually collapses. So these are the questions for today. What disappeared with the fall of the Roman Empire? When you have a society just basically collapse, what disappears with it? And how was the church to survive this collapse of the Roman Empire? So think about that for a few moments. And then when you're ready, come back. Well, one thing, I'm going to go back to that map. Without Rome as center, all these places split into little territories. So the Roman troops left England in 410 AD. They went to defend Rome. Where did that leave the Christians? Christianity didn't leave. You still had Christians there, but they no longer had access to Rome. They were on their own. The Brits were on their own, and they had to fight against or hold off against invading Angles and Jutes and Saxons that were coming and invading the country. And they did. They held on, and this becomes the Celtic Church. France, the Franks, they ended up splitting off. Spain splits off. They're all splitting off. They're all going their own way. So one of the things that happened is that language that had bound them together, Latin, starts to disappear. You have Celtic language taking over. You have the beginnings of French, the beginnings of English, the beginnings of Spanish, Italian, German. They're all sort of taking over. They're going their own way. You have, with attacks, war. You know, in times of war, sometimes luxuries are no longer important. What you're trying to do is make sure you survive, that you have shelter, that you have food, and that you keep out of the way of the armies. So learning, schools, they're not important. You've got to just survive. You've got a survivor's mentality. There are schools. Learning does exist, but not in the open society. It's going to be found inside the churches, inside the monasteries, people who are setting themselves off from the world, and so they can focus on Jesus, but they're keeping alive some of that ancient knowledge. A lot of the knowledge is lost, however. No, the Eastern Empire keeps going. It's doing fine. It's going to have problems a bit later because of a new religion that will grow up in Arabia called Islam. But right now, at this time of the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Eastern Empire is doing quite well. The monasteries became the guardians. You still had these mass conversions. So this again is some of the bad side. Charlemagne, it's a story that Charlemagne drove his enemies. He defeated them and he drove them across the river. And then he said, well, you've just been baptized, you're Christian. And they're going, oh, okay. He defeated us. He told us this is the penalty. You're going to be Christian. So we're a Christian. What did they know of Christianity? So you have, again, this ignorance of the people that's growing. But you also had people who did understand Jesus, Christianity, the gospel, and they were very, very devout Christians. And they tried to set up enclaves, areas where God's kingdom was on earth. And these were the monasteries and the convents. And so they would focus on doing God's stuff. Well, they also were known for being lazy, sponging off the people. You know, hey, guys, I think you need to send me some food. I'll pray for you. Dear God, keep them safe. Give me a good meal. Well, you know, that doesn't go over too well. Saint Benedict came on the scene somewhere along the line. And he basically said, this is terrible. This is like turning people off Christianity. And so he set up the Benedictine rule. And it's basically, you know, it governs your day. So when you get up in the morning, this is what you're doing. This is how you're praying. Then you have so many hours of work. Then you've got so many hours of prayer, food, and so on and so on. And you get up in the middle of the night too to pray. So it's a very strict life of prayer, but they're also working and they're producing. So the Benedictine monasteries, you know, you can get good cheese there, you can get good wine there. They've been around for, oh gosh, probably 1,500 years, and they're still going strong. But that Benedictine rule becomes core to many of the monasteries is, yes, we are apart from society. We've separated from everyday world, but that doesn't mean we have complete freedom. It means we are to dedicate ourselves to God, and this is how we're going to do it. Learning, Charlemagne, you start having the revival of learning. Charlemagne is able, he creates the Holy Roman Empire, but he's able to bring some kind of stability to society, and he calls, like Constantine called all the bishops, Charlemagne calls the scholars and says, you know, let's get the learning going. Let's kickstart society. So we've done this. And this is the other thing. The church service in the Western Church is still in Latin, but very few people. The monks speak Latin, the priests speak Latin, the nuns speak Latin, but ordinary people, they're speaking German and French and Italian, Anglo-Saxon, okay? So you've now got more ignorance because they don't even speak the language, and they can't read, and they can't read the Bible even if they could read, because the Bible is in Greek or Latin. And so you've got this gap that's emerging between what the priests know and what the people know. So this was a big challenge. If people couldn't read and didn't understand Latin or Greek, how could they learn about Jesus? So I want you to think about that. Just stop the video here and take a couple of minutes to try to think. If you were a priest and you're trying to minister to your flock, how are you going to tell them about Jesus? How are you going to reach them? How are you going to reassure them? And think about that. And then when you're ready, come back. Well, we'll jump jumps forward a bit to the Middle Ages, anywhere around 1000 AD. And now we have what's called the Great Schism. It's been happening for years. That Eastern Empire that's going Greek and the Western Empire going Latin. And they finally have had enough of each other and they split officially. And that's the first official split. It's not that one group just leaves, it's we're one church and we're now going to divide. We can't work with each other. And that's called the Great Schism. So now you've got here the Orthodox Church, and they're going to go off and do their thing, but they're going to split into like Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, other different types of Orthodox churches. But they're all basically having, I believe, I don't know as much about these churches, but they have very similar beliefs, worship structure. They're all within that Orthodox community. And I can talk a bit more about them in the 20th century, 21st century, but I'll hold off on that till later. This chart is wrong because you didn't have the Roman Catholic Church, you had the Catholic Church. It's not Roman until Reformation times. There is one Western church, and that's the Catholic Church. And they did come up with new ways to spread the word. One way was through books. The monks would write the books, by hand, but everything was by hand. So they transcribe, and you have these Latin pages that maybe people could read and maybe they couldn't. But just in case, you had symbolism and artwork put around the words, and you had pictures. So if you can't read the story, you can look at the pictures and you will learn the story through the pictures. I'm going to minimize me. And you can see here is a stained glass window. And the stained glass windows, they tell stories from Jesus's life or from the Bibles. They might tell Adam and Eve or Noah and the ark, Moses, the 10 law commandments, but Jesus is the prime one. And now people, they can't read, but they can look at the pictures and they can learn the stories from the pictures. Statues. Statues have been used before, I'm sure. And they are ways, again, of reinforcing something tangible and visible. Mary is Queen Mother because she's Mother of God. And so you have the statue, and when you see her, you learn, you remember the story. And of course, we had Christmas plays and Easter plays. We still have them. And the thing is that after umpteen years of telling the Christmas story, it gets a little boring. So, we try to jazz it up a little bit. I think there's a Bing Crosby, a movie, and what they did at one point was they sang Happy Birthday to Jesus. First time we'd ever thought of singing Happy Birthday to Jesus. Other times you have, well, the innkeeper is drunk, or they're stopping at the Holiday Inn. We're doing something to make it more interesting for people who've seen the same story for 50 years, okay? Well, at some point, the stories became a little too much, too rambunctious, too much off color. And the church said, this is not appropriate for church building out on the streets. And so they went out on the streets, and that's the beginning of modern theater. Our theater does not come from ancient Rome or Greece. It's nothing like what they had. It's completely different, but it comes out of the miracle plays in the Middle Ages that got a little too off color and were kicked outside. but they told the story. They taught people about Jesus. How do you teach people that something is sacred and how to behave in a sacred spot? Medieval architecture does a beautiful, beautiful job. If you could see it and Google some of the Gothic art, here you see a person. This is a person. It looks like he's an adult man. Look at the size. You walk into that building and your eyes are going, wow. Your voice goes down to a whisper. You are in the presence of something awesome, powerful, a lot bigger than me. Right away, you've conveyed through architecture the majesty of God. This, some of you may never have seen. It's a labyrinth. Labyrinths have been around for thousands of years. Many of them trace back to Greece. But this type is a different model than the ones that the Greeks had. And this is the one that's found in Chartres. And it's basically, they're built around pi. So they tap into a different way of thinking. There's something called sacred geometry that I think I got up to chapter 1.5 before I got lost. But when you walk around, it's not a maze. You can't get lost in it. There's only one path that you can walk. And when you walk it all, eventually you're going to get to the center and eventually you walk out. There's no dead ends. Everything curves, winds around. And it gets past your rational mind for some reason. So you can come in with a question, and as you're walking and thinking about the question, things pop into your mind, and suddenly you may find that you have a new way of looking at it or an answer. You may find that there's this peace that comes on you. Other people have said it's like walking to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the holy city. You want to see where Jesus lived, where Jesus died. But if you're a poor person, you're not going to be able to afford the trip to get down from England to Jerusalem. But this was a poor man's way of doing it. And you could stop along the way and this part of Jesus's life or that part of Jesus's life, and you're up here. These were ways of communicating the gospel, the sense of God, the awe, the majesty, the power of God to people who couldn't read. Once again, you've got this church-state confrontation and alliance. Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope. So that meant, or he was crowned with the Pope's approval. So suddenly the Pope has authority over the king, or over the emperor, or does he? And you start to see this fight over power. Henry II in England is fed up with something his archbishop is doing. He makes a comment. Some of his followers kill Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope excommunicates Henry, and now no one can talk to him, give him food, shelter. He's basically shunned by society. He's the king. He has no recourse except to apologize to the Pope and let the Pope do whatever the Pope wants to do. Philip, I think it was Philip II in France, had a mistress. Same type of thing. Pope basically said, mistresses ain't allowed. Get rid of her or you're excommunicated. And again, he ended up having to give in. Now the Pope has a lot of political power. And you know that the kings are sort of waiting until they can get that power back. And you're setting up something that's going to happen, we're going to look at next week. So we've talked about trying to get the message across to people who can't read. We've talked about this church state, this mass conversion, a lot of ignorance, but there's also a lot of good people. And the church is founding the universities. And they're thinking, they're debating, what does this mean? What does that mean? You may have heard about arguing over how many angels fit on the head of a pin. Okay, some of those arguments were a little much. They were trying to prove God's existence. How can you prove God's existence to someone who doesn't believe? It's how do we share the gospel to people who don't know it? And they're arguing. But some of the good things that came out of those debates was Thomas Aquinas' just war theory. It had been around before. The Greeks had it, the Romans had it. But, he sort of fleshes it out a bit more. When are you permitted to go to war? When are you not permitted to go to war? And so it's like for a just cause, when someone attacks you, but you're not allowed to attack them first. And it should be proportionate response. So you've got all these kind of rules going on. And then the whole idea during the Middle Ages, and even before, is when the church had power, what the church tries to do is bring a bit of heaven on earth. We're trying to create heaven on earth. And so you're looking at society and people are fighting, and how can we reach them? How can we make them understand God is love or God brings peace? So you end up with rules like no fighting on Christmas, no fighting on Good Friday, no fighting on Easter. That lasts till World War I. World War I, you have stories, English, Germans fighting. Christmas Day, English, Germans exchanging gifts. Afterwards, fighting. But for one day, they remembered they were Christians. Limits, no meat on Friday. Again, it's trying to make you think about God is in your life 24/7. What can we do to help you remember? So they have all these things coming in. The religious orders, and I said not all from the Middle Ages. I'm Protestant, Presbyterian, as I said earlier. I don't know a lot of these religious orders, and I don't know when they started, and I couldn't find the webpage I used to have. So, but you have this dual movement in Christianity and all the religions where you focus on yourself, the inward journey, prayer, trying to reach God through mysticism, mystical practice, meditation, different things. You're separating yourself from the world in order to pray for the world. Or you're out in the world helping people, doing something concrete. Or you're balancing the two. And so that's what the categories are. So the inward focus, the Carthusians really isolate themselves from society. The Benedictines, they isolated themselves too, but they also worked to create something for people. The Cistercians are in there too. So for this mixed focus, the Franciscans, St. Francis is one of the best, where you're focusing on the poor and the sick, but you're also making sure your own spiritual connection with God is very strong. The outward focus, the Dominicans focus on education. So they're going to be doing a lot of the teaching, setting up the schools. Gray nuns are setting up hospitals. Paulists are visiting the sick and prisoners, though condemned to die. I need a typo there, I need to fix. And they're the ones that burying the dead. Different other orders are also working in hospitals. And of course, the Knights Templar, you may have heard of them in the Da Vinci Code. And they're the ones, the soldiers, the military, fighting to defend Christendom, fighting to defend Christian countries from non-Christian invaders. And there are non-Christian invaders. Please understand that. But what is remarkable about the Catholic Church at this time? The church is quite rich. There's a lot of corruption in it. the feudal system is playing a role. I'll talk more about that next week, but the Middle Ages is the heyday of the feudalism, where you've got the first son inherits the land, the second son joins the army, the third son joins the church, whether he wants to or not. That's what he's expected to do. So you got church people who aren't very religious, but they're there because of the third son. You've got people that really like the power, and you've got people that are convicted by Jesus, that are very devout, and they're trying to navigate their way through this, the church's power. And you've also got people that are very devout, committed to Jesus, and they say the church should give everything away and should just work with the people, with the poor. We need to identify with them. Well, you can imagine those in power didn't want to give up their power. But what the Catholic Church managed to do was create space. You are a religious order that are going to focus on prayer. You're a religious order that focuses on the poor. You're a religious order that focuses on the sick. So you've got your ministry and you're focusing on what God is calling you to do, and you're staying within this umbrella called the Catholic Church. I was going to say no Protestant denomination has ever succeeded. I've learned that there are some Protestant denominations that do have different religious orders, but generally speaking, the Protestant organizations tend to split. You don't see too many that have an umbrella saying, this is who we are, and yes, you can do your thing and still be part of our denomination. But the Catholic Church has managed to do that, and that's quite impressive. So questions to think about. You've got that big picture that basically, believe it or not, we've done about 1,300 years of history. What weaknesses do you see beginning to emerge in the church during the Middle Ages? And whether you see it as weakness or not depends sort of what denomination you are. And what are the strengths that you see? Because you had a kickstart in the Middle Ages, but you're going to have a radical revolution coming with the Renaissance and the 15th century, 16th century. And now suddenly everything's going to get thrown up in the air. And what's going to happen? So this is where you get to see what are the issues that you're beginning to see. What are the gifts that are also there to be drawn on. And that's what we're going to be looking at this in session 3. So thank you for joining. And I said, this is a very, it's a survey course, but thank you for joining. And once again, I'm the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Gaver, and send me your questions. I'll try to find some answers. Thank you, and see you next week. Take care and God bless.